My name is Chad. I've been writing a book forever, for a very long time. I have a relationship with this project. It's kind of like my mother living with me against my will. This weird relationship. But I entered it. I entered the full manuscript in the contest this past year and won a very nice prize. And so I'm going to just read you part of one chapter. And I think I should probably spend like 40 minutes telling you, like maybe 50 minutes telling you about like all the characters and what's happening and who they are and everything. But I just refuse to do that. And you can't make me do it, Star. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to kind of just go through it, and there's some different people in it and some different things happening. This is a flashback. It'll flash forward to the present action, and I think you'll understand. The book is called, right now, A Plague of Caterpillars, and this is one of the later chapters. I hope you enjoy it. And I'm recovering from a cold, so I cough about every 10 minutes. And so I think I'll cough 1.5 times during this. So pardon me in advance. In the autumn of my 8th year, my father brought my older brother and me to Oak Creek Canyon. It was our first camping trip without Mom. Dad had promised when Marshall and I were old enough to look after himself, he'd take us on a big adventure. Into the high country, said Dad. Just me and the boys. Marshall and I cheered when Dad announced it. My mother leaned against the kitchen counter and folded her lanky arms. What? Said Dad. What's the matter? Just a feeling I have, she said, going so far away. It's not that far, said Dad. Mom looked him over as one would examine a lamp at a yard sale. His bony arms, sunken chest. She popped her gum. What if somebody gets hurt? She said. Dad shrugged. There's a hospital right there. Can't be more than an hour away. Our Ford station wagon was heavy laden, considering the trip was just for Columbus Day weekend. Dad compensated for his lack of adventuring experience by planning for every contingency. He had packed extra sleeping bags, ropes, tarpaulins, a case of pork and beans, and an entire spare tent. We had at least 10 rolls of toilet paper. Charmin, said Dad, the good stuff. We each kissed Mom goodbye, and although there are details of the trip I have forgotten, I clearly remember she cried. I did no such thing, she later claimed. What's the worst that could have happened? Someone drops a hot dog on the ground? But she never heard the entire story. She never heard about the man in the water. With the rear fenders riding low over the tires, we struck north into the cool, high country like a very well-equipped but harmless detachment of conquistadors. The ponderosa pines stood verdant against the canyon walls, while cottonwood nestled in the creek bed. Goblin head formations of red rock bloomed along the rim of the canyon above, their stone faces turning to watch us as we passed by. Oak Creek was a small mountain stream that even young kids could safely play in, but that year it was red and swollen with monsoon rains. Bleeding Jupiter, that water's high, said Dad, craning his neck to glance down into the gorge. That afternoon we pitched our tent and went down to the water to investigate. The water roared over the smooth boulders, and the bloated pools boiled like great bowls of broth. Well, the fishing's all blown out, boys. Dad stood on the bank and shook his head. Sorry about that. We built a fire and roasted hot dogs. Soon it was dark and the crickets droned in the blackness. Know what we'll do, said Dad? Tomorrow. We'll take some sandwiches and hike up to the ghost mine. Ghosts, said Marshall. It was unwise of my father to use that word while in the company of young boys in the dark very far from their mother, but there were many things Dad had yet to learn. It's an old abandoned gold mine up on the hill, Marsh, some old buildings. I went up there with your grandpa once and found an old lantern. Dad changed the subject by pointing out how the night sky looked different, well away from the glare of city lights. The stars spread like phosphorescent dust across the black velvet of space. It rained a little overnight, and in the morning the air was filled with the wet, acrid smell of October. Dad cooked ham and eggs for breakfast, and there was enough left over to make 10 or 12 sandwiches for lunch. These he loaded into an army rucksack along with some apples, and we set out for the ghost mine. The steep trail took us to the top of a ravine, which commanded a view of several miles of canyon and the frothy creek below. Even from that height, we could hear it plunge and hiss. There among the undergrowth lurked tumble-down shacks and iron frameworks of unknown purpose. We kicked the ground and unearthed fragments of ceramic crockery. I found a horseshoe disfigured by tumors of rust. Dad explained how the miners pressurized the water by sending it down smaller and smaller pipes. Pipes were held up by that scaffold, see, and when the water got to the nozzle, it was like a fire hose. They shot it at that hillside over there, and the slurry flowed down here, see, into these troughs to settle out the ore. So where'd they go? Asked Marshall, hands shoved into his pockets. Why'd they quit? Dad scanned the debris. Nothing lasts forever, I guess. We ate as much as we could, but the rucksack weighed much the same after lunch as it did before. The egg sandwiches gave us gas of the most sulfuric kind, and we tried without agreement to judge whose was worse. The air grew hot and still. We gathered on the floor of a roofless barracks house, and before long we fell asleep. We awoke to ripping booms of thunder. Without speaking, we gathered our things and headed back. It began to rain, and the trail turned slick. My dad slipped and fell more than either Marshall or I. Soon the trail was crossed with rivulets. We'd left behind our rain jackets and galoshes, and we were wet to the skin and muddy. The last mile of trail ran along the creek, and the water rose seemingly before our eyes. Flash flood, said Dad. Let's hurry now. Trees tumbled by in the frothy red current. The water rose again, and in a few places the trail was underwater. My dad worked hard to pretend that we were in no danger, but he had to raise his voice against the roar. You know what we'll do, he hollered? We'll pack up and head down to the Indian ruins. They have cabins shaped like teepees. Stay with me, boys. Careful. And there's an old guy who makes arrowheads. Won't that be fun? From up ahead, a woman came running down the trail, flailing her arms and shrieking. She was younger than my grandma, but older than my mother. And although she wore a yellow rain slicker, her hair and clothes were soaked and splotched with mud. Dad intercepted her, but before he could ask what the matter was, she clutched his sleeve and dragged him up the trail. Marshall and I ran after them. We came around a turn and saw the trouble. A man had fallen into the churning pool at a bend in the creek. The pool was 50 feet across, and the man was pinned to the massive outfall like an insect against a bathtub drain. He could neither free himself nor float further down, and when the water surged, it covered his head. He wore a yellow slicker like that of the woman, and he was of the same age, and so I took him for her husband. The creek was 10 or 12 feet below the trail, at the foot of an undercut bank. The woman began to clamber down the roots and boulders, screaming hysterically, but Dad took her by the slicker and yanked her up again. He shouted into her face and made her stay put at the edge of the trail, and then he waved us over. Rain streamed down his face. In his eyes I could read his fear, but there was something else too, something I could not account for until years later. He pointed to the woman and said, "Stay with her." I wasn't sure if we were to keep her away from the water or the other way around, but she hugged us closely and awkwardly while she crouched in the mud sobbing. My father backed away from the creek as far as the trees and undergrowth would allow. Then he took a running start, hurled himself from the overhanging bank, and disappeared into the water with a splash. In the elongated moment before he surfaced, Marshall and I tore away from the woman. She managed to hold me back, but Marshall was stronger, and he began to climb down to the water. In the pool, my father side-stroked furiously to gain the far side and lifted himself onto the bank and knelt, panting and dripping on the rocks. He lost his eyeglasses, and he was missing one shoe, but from that side of the creek he was almost within reach of the outfall. The man in the slicker had all but stopped struggling. His face was in the water, and his arms trailed in the current like ribbons of cloth. My father lay on his stomach atop a boulder and stretched out to reach him. He took hold of the yellow slicker, but had little leverage, and so he wrenched the man, inch by inch, with only the strength of his stringy arms. A few times he almost fell in. However, the jostling revived the man, and with one great lunge, the man clawed his way to the boulder, where he collapsed, gasping like some primordial amphibian. That's when my father spotted Marshall, who had waded up to his hips on the far side of the creek. He bawled with arms outstretched like a toddler, stumbling. Dad screamed at him to move back, but Marshall was swept into the swirling pool where he spun like a sock in a vast washing machine. In another second, he too was sucked against the outfall and immobilized. My father lay down on the boulder again and got hold of Marshall's arm and fought the water with ever-diminishing strength. Through the red-stained froth, Marshall looked very small and pale, and he was not moving at all. Then I saw the man in the yellow slicker raise up beside my father. His long mustaches were still wet, and he looked very much like a walrus. After a series of urgent shouts and gestures, the man braced my father at the waist, and they hauled Marshall to safety. Once reunited, we all embraced in a single sodden cluster. When the man, whose name was Ernst, discovered we were campers, he said we must stay with him that night. "Ah, that's very kind," my dad demurred, "but we've got a big cabin tent and lots of pork and beans." "No, young man," said Ernst, holding up a finger. I insist, and I will not take no for an answer. My father looked at Marshall and me, shivering in the rain. Then he nodded, and the two men shook hands. And so that day I learned something of the ways and means of gentlemen. We drove down to a cottage in Sedona where Marshall and I were pampered at the hand of the woman whose name was Harriet. We took hot baths and drank cocoa, and then we were shown to a room with one large bed. Dad threw back the quilt, and Marshall and I climbed in on either side of him. When we had settled, Marshall asked, "Why'd you do it?" "What? Help Ernst? He was in trouble." "Would he have died?" "Probably." "Yes." "What if you died?" "I didn't die." "But what if you did? And what if I did? What then?" "Well," said Dad, "that's a good question, Marsh. First of all, you had no business getting in the water that way. You're not a very strong swimmer." "Neither are you," said Marshall. "That is true." "So, why'd you do it?" Dad considered this. "I suppose we see someone who needs help, and before we really know it, we're helping them." There was again a quality in his voice that I could not name. "We were scared," said Marshall. "I wasn't," I said, sitting up. "Yes, you were," he said. "Yes, I was." "Stop it, you two. I'm sorry. Look, I was scared too." "You were?" "Oh, yeah. And imagine how Ernst felt. And Harriet." We were quiet a while. I pressed my face into the pillow and dozed. "Boys," we grunted. "Listen, wake up a sec. We need to be careful about how we tell your mother about what happened at the river." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we can't tell your mother what happened at the river." Next day, Ernst and Harriet took us to Montezuma's castle, an ancient dwelling set in a cliff wall. Ernst was very tired and needed frequent rest stops. Dad stayed by his side while Harriet took Marshall and me by the hands and bought us Indian war bonnets and ice cream cones. We found the arrowhead maker. His skin was creased and deeply brown, and his eyes were watery. He wore a traditional costume of coarse native clothing and sat outside the souvenir shop on a stubby stool of his own making. With bits of stone and antler, he knapped obsidian arrowheads, which he sold for $1 each. Marshall gave the old man $1, and a few minutes later he gave Marshall an arrowhead. Marshall turned it over, and the sun flashed in its black scalloped surface. I gave the old man my $1, and he started a new one. "Could this kill a man?" Marshall asked, testing the sharp end with his thumb. "These arrowheads are not for fighting," said the old man, without looking up from his work. "What are they for then?" He finished the arrowhead and placed it in my hand. "For courage." Ernst and Dad joined us while the old man sorted through the box of stone flakes to begin again. "Dad, we got arrowheads," said Marshall. "Isn't that something?" Dad took out his wallet and stood before the old man. The arrowhead maker raised his hand and blinked at my father. There were scrapes on Dad's chin and a cut on the bridge of his nose where his glasses had been. His knuckles were scuffed, red, and bruised. Dad pulled out $1 and offered it. The arrowhead maker shook his head. "You don't need one of these." I took this to mean my father had courage. That was only part of the truth. Naomi gave me the rest. She was never more correct than she was that day on the Jeep trail. She recognized I was chosen to help her. It's possible I knew too, but Naomi saw it first, and she said so. "You can't leave us here now." That's all she said. It was not a plea, nor the justification of some argument that I must refute or accept. It was a statement of fact. That is when I understood the look my father gave me before he jumped into the seething cauldron. It was certainty. When my father saw Ernst in the grip of the outfall, he knew his life had been reduced to a single calling and objective that would not be repudiated. Maybe he believed God wanted him to save that man. Or perhaps he viewed it as something mindless, an endlessly complex set of tumblers which fell into place to unlock the door that opened onto his fate. He never explained those things to me, but as the compass passed from Naomi's hand to mine, I realized that from her standpoint, none of that mattered. My father and no one else had been called to jump into the water that day. So he jumped, and so would I. "If I go," I said, "we have to do things my way." I got up from the dirt and slid the compass into my pocket. "We have to have a map." Naomi nodded. "Then go and get your map." Thanks.